He was a defeated soldier, a prisoner thousands of miles from home, expecting nothing but contempt from his captors. The last thing Karl Neumann ever imagined was sitting side by side with his enemies, singing hymns from his childhood in his own language. He didn't know this single hour would challenge everything he thought he knew about war, hatred, and humanity. He didn't know that a simple invitation into a wooden chapel in the heart of Louisiana would become the most profound moment of his life. But as the music swelled around him, one question echoed in his soul. Could a shared prayer truly erase the battle lines drawn in blood? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Louisiana morning of late summer, 1945, was not born, it was exhaled, a thick, wet breath that clung to the skin and filled the lungs with the scent of decay and relentless life. The air itself was a character in the grim play of the POW camp, a heavy blanket of humidity woven with the incessant, high-pitched buzz of insects. It pressed down on the tar-papered roofs of the barracks and settled in the perpetual reddish-brown mud that was the camp's foundation. This mud, a slurry of damp earth and crushed gravel, was a living entity clinging to boots, staining trousers, and sucking at the shovels of the men tasked with fighting its dominion. Barbed wire fences, the skeletal fingers of their defeat, stretched into the hazy distance, their lines seeming to shimmer and melt in the oppressive heat, enclosing a world that had shrunk to the size of this miserable patch of swamp. Karl Neumann, at 22, felt 1,000 years old. His body, once lean and strong from hikes in the hills above Heidelberg, was now thin and weary, a frame for the exhaustion that had settled deep in his bones. He was a former literature student, a young man who had once found worlds in the verses of Goethe and Schiller. Now, his world was the weight of a shovel in his hands, its wooden handle slick with sweat and its metal blade heavy with the muck he was supposed to be clearing from a drainage ditch. His movements were mechanical, a rhythm of dig, lift, and toss that had become the metronome of his existence. He worked alongside other ghosts, men who, like him, had been stripped of their names and histories, reduced to a number and a uniform of faded gray. Beside him, Klaus Richter grunted, his shovel plunging into the sucking earth with a wet schlop. A Berliner in his 30s, Klaus was a veteran of campaigns Karl had only read about in sanitized military dispatches. He was hardened, cynical, and his distrust of their American captors was as constant as the Louisiana heat. He wiped a forearm across his brow, smearing a fresh layer of mud over the old. "They work us like mules," he muttered, his voice a low rasp. "For what? To drain a swamp that God himself intended to be wet. This is their revenge, not labor. A slow, petty revenge for battles they never had to fight on their own soil." On Karl's other side, Heinrich Bauer, barely 18, panted with the effort. He was a boy, fresh-faced and terrified, plucked from a classroom in Bavaria and thrown into the meat grinder of the war's final desperate months. A fragile optimism still flickered in his eyes, a flame that seemed dangerously out of place here. "Perhaps if we work hard, they will give us better rations," Heinrich suggested, his voice thin and hopeful. Klaus scoffed, a harsh, grating sound. "Hope is a luxury, boy, remember that. They give us just enough to keep us digging, just enough to keep the machine of their vengeance running. Hope is the first thing they starve out of you." Karl said nothing. His focus narrowed to the task. The sting of sweat dripped into his eyes, and the drone of the cicadas was a relentless drilling noise that vibrated in his skull. The air was thick with the smell of the mud, a primal odor of rot and dampness mixed with the sour scent of unwashed bodies. His mind, a vessel that once held the soaring beauty of poetry, now replayed the same dull loop of disillusionment. He remembered a line from Rilke, "You must change your life." And a bitter, silent laugh formed in his chest. He had once debated the meaning of that line in a sunlit university hall, surrounded by books and the bright faces of his peers. Now the words were a cruel joke. His life had been changed for him, ground down into this ugly, monotonous reality. He was a ghost, a number, his identity a casualty of a war he no longer understood. As the afternoon sun began its slow, merciless descent, the workday ended. The prisoners trudged back from the ditches and fields, their shoulders slumped, their faces masks of grime and fatigue. They lined up in the main camp yard, a sea of gray figures waiting for the familiar dismissal that would grant them a few hours of respite before the cycle began anew. But today was different. An American guard, Sergeant O'Connell, a man in his 40s with a stern jaw and eyes that betrayed no emotion, approached the returning work detail. His face was a familiar fixture of the camp, a stony visage that promised nothing and gave nothing away. Instead of the usual curt nod, he stopped before them, his gaze sweeping over the exhausted men. "Neumann, Richter, Bauer." O'Connell's voice was flat, cutting through the weary silence. He continued down a short list, naming 10 men in total. "You 10, fall in, on the double." A ripple of fear, cold and immediate, went through the assembled prisoners. Nervous, questioning glances were exchanged. A special summons was never good news. It meant interrogation, punishment for some unknown infraction, or worse, a transfer to a camp rumored to be even more brutal than this one. The men whose names had not been called shifted their weight, a collective sigh of relief mingling with the pity they felt for the chosen few. Klaus moved to stand beside Karl, his earlier cynicism replaced by a tense alertness. "Here it comes," he whispered, his eyes fixed on O'Connell. "Someone talked, or they found another reason to make an example of us. Keep your mouth shut, Karl. Say nothing." Karl's heart began to pound against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He felt a cold dread spread through his chest as his mind raced, retracing his steps, his conversations, searching for any transgression. Had he been overheard humming a forbidden song? Had a letter home been misinterpreted? The possibilities were endless and terrifying. The setting sun cast long, ominous shadows across the yard, transforming the familiar shapes of the barracks into monstrous silhouettes. The American guards stood impassively, the metallic click of their rifles as they shifted their positions, the only sound in the charged silence. Sergeant O'Connell and another guard led the 10 selected Germans away from the main barracks. The crunch of their boots on the gravel path was unnaturally loud. They marched in silence, the tension a palpable thing that bound them together. Heinrich, walking just ahead of Karl, was visibly trembling, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. Klaus had a look of grim resignation on his face, as if he were marching to a fate he had long expected. Karl's senses were heightened, every detail of his surroundings amplified. He was trying to decipher their destination, to find some clue in the geography of their confinement. They passed the familiar structures, the mess hall, the infirmary, and headed towards a more isolated part of the camp. Ahead of them stood a small, simple wooden building. They had all noticed it before, but had paid it little attention, assuming it was for storage or some minor administrative use. As they drew closer, Karl could see a detail he had previously missed. A simple wooden cross, unadorned and stark, was fixed to the peak of its roof. It was a chapel. This discovery did not bring relief. It only deepened the mystery and his suspicion. Why would they be taken to a church? The question echoed in the fearful silence of his mind. A church? He thought, his stomach twisting. Is this a new form of psychological torment? To parade us before their God and mock our defeat? To force us to kneel and confess our sins while they stand over us in judgment? The idea was so perverse, so cruel, that it seemed entirely plausible. The grand, state-sanctioned cathedrals of home were symbols of power and national pride, their stone walls echoing with centuries of authority. This humble wooden structure felt different, its simplicity unsettling and alien. The walk felt like a lifetime, a green mile winding through the heart of their captivity. The familiar sounds of the camp, the distant shouts, the clanging of metal, faded behind them, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the soft sigh of the wind through the tall pine trees that bordered this section of the camp. The chapel, bathed in the fading light of dusk, appeared almost surreal, a misplaced object in a landscape of punishment. At the entrance to the wooden building, the guards stopped. The prisoners shuffled to a halt, their eyes darting from the closed door to the impassive faces of O'Connell and the other guard. From inside, they could perceive the low murmur of voices and see the soft, flickering glow of candlelight through the plain glass windows. Sergeant O'Connell turned to face them, his expression as unreadable as ever. For a long moment, he simply looked at them, his gaze passing over each man. "Chaplain's orders," he said finally, his voice still flat but perhaps lacking the hard edge it usually carried. "You will go inside. You will be respectful. You will cause no trouble." As he spoke, the chapel door opened. A man in a chaplain's uniform stood framed in the doorway, the warm light from within creating a halo around his silhouette. He was in his 50s, with a kind, round face and gentle eyes that seemed to see past their filthy uniforms and into the weary souls within. He nodded to the group of stunned prisoners. "Willkommen," the chaplain said, his voice calm and welcoming. The German word, spoken without a trace of mockery, was a profound shock, a key turning in a lock they didn't know existed. "Please come in." The 10 Germans were stunned into absolute silence. They looked at each other, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. They looked at the guards who merely gestured towards the open door. They looked back at the chaplain, who simply waited, his expression one of patient invitation. Hesitantly, one by one, they began to move. Karl felt as if he were stepping out of his own body, watching himself take a slow, deliberate step across the threshold. His boots, caked in the day's mud, were loud on the clean wooden floor. He crossed from the world of wire and mud and suspicion into a space filled with warmth and light. His eyes, accustomed to the harsh glare of the yard and the gloom of the barracks, took a moment to adjust to the dim, soft candlelight. And then he saw it. The impossible. The chapel was not empty. It was filled with American soldiers. They were not standing guard along the walls, their rifles at the ready. They were sitting in the pews, their uniforms clean, their faces turned towards the front. As the Germans entered, the Americans turned to look at them. There was no hatred in their eyes, no mockery, no contempt. There was only a simple, quiet curiosity. Karl's gaze swept across the room, and his breath caught in his throat. He was no longer a prisoner being led to his punishment. He was a man walking into a church. The part ended on Karl's face, a mask of profound shock and utter confusion, as he tried to comprehend the scene before him, a scene that defied every law of the world he now inhabited. Father Dubois gestured with an open palm towards the pews. There were no designated sections, no invisible lines drawn on the floor to separate the victors from the vanquished. The pews were simply open, waiting. For a long, suspended moment, the 10 Germans stood frozen, a tight cluster of gray uniforms just inside the door, as if an invisible barrier still held them captive. The warmth of the chapel, so welcoming a moment before, now felt like a trap. Then, prodded by a subtle nod from the chaplain, they began to move, their heavy boots sounding like sacrilege on the clean floorboards. They filed in awkwardly, each man seeking the comforting anonymity of the group, yet forced to disperse into the empty spaces between the American soldiers. Karl found himself at the end of a pew near the front. As he sat, the rough-hewn wood solid beneath him, he became acutely aware of the man just a few feet away. He was a young American soldier, a corporal, with a face that couldn't be much older than Karl's own. In the soft candlelight, Karl could see details with a startling, unwanted clarity. The collar of the man's uniform was slightly frayed at the edge. A faint silvery scar cut a diagonal line across his cheek, and his hands, resting on his knee, were calloused like a farmer's. This was Corporal Davis, though Karl would not learn his name until much later. He was no longer a faceless enemy, a silhouette in the distance to be feared or hated. He was a young man with a tired look in his eyes, a man who had likely seen things that would haunt his sleep just as Karl had. The proximity was unnerving, a violation of the unspoken rules of their existence. They were meant to be separated by wire, by language, by an ocean of blood. Yet here they were, breathing the same air, sharing the same wooden bench, the space between them charged with the history of 1,000 battlefields. Karl kept his eyes fixed forward, on the simple wooden altar and the flickering candles that smelled of wax and pine. He could feel Klaus's anger radiating from the pew behind him. Klaus had deliberately chosen a spot by himself, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his body a fortress of defiance. Karl could almost hear the cynical thoughts churning in his friend's mind. He heard Klaus mutter to the man next to him, his voice a low, venomous hiss. A performance. For the Red Cross, no doubt. They will write reports about their humane treatment while we rot in this swamp. The American soldiers watched the Germans file in, their expressions ranging from guarded curiosity to a sort of weary indifference. There was no open hostility, no sneering, none of the contempt they had been conditioned to expect. It was this very neutrality that was so disorienting. Hatred was a language Karl understood. It was the foundation upon which his world had been built for the past 6 years. This quiet, almost mundane acceptance was a dialect he could not comprehend. His internal monologue was a whirlwind of confusion and suspicion. He was prepared for anything, a beating, an interrogation, a new form of humiliation. But he was not prepared for this. The service was about to begin. Father Dubois stepped to the front, his presence filling the small chapel with a sense of calm authority. Another American soldier, a private, stood up and began distributing hymn books from a stack he held in his arms. He moved down the aisle, passing the books along each pew to the American soldiers. When he reached the pews where the Germans were scattered, he paused, turned, and picked up a different, smaller stack of books from a table near the front. He approached them, his footsteps echoing in the expectant silence. He handed a book to the man at the end of the first row, who took it with a look of bewilderment. The private continued down the line, his movements efficient and impersonal. When he reached Karl, he held out a book. Karl took it automatically, his fingers closing around the worn, soft cover. He stared at it for a moment, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. The title was not in English. It was printed in familiar, Gothic script. He opened it with trembling fingers. The text was in German. Every word, every verse was from his homeland. He looked up, his eyes wide with astonishment, searching for Father Dubois. The chaplain met his gaze and gave a small, understanding smile. Then, Father Dubois addressed the entire congregation, his voice clear and steady, resonating in the small, intimate space. "Tonight," he began, his gaze sweeping over every face, American and German alike. "We are not soldiers. We are not enemies. Tonight, we are all just children of God, gathered in His house. Let us raise our voices together. We will begin with hymn number 12, Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott." He said the title first in German, the familiar words a thunderclap in the silence of Karl's mind, and then in English, "A mighty fortress is our God." A low murmur of shock and disbelief rippled through the German prisoners. Heinrich, sitting 2 rows behind Karl, let out a small, choked sob, quickly stifling it with his hand. Even Klaus, the unshakable cynic, was momentarily stunned into silence, his arms uncrossing as he stared at the chaplain, his mask of defiance cracking for just a second. Karl felt a powerful, overwhelming wave of emotion wash over him. This hymn book, this small, tangible object in his hands, was more than just paper and ink. It was a piece of his childhood, a recognition of his language, his culture, his very identity. It was the absolute antithesis of the dehumanization he had endured for so long, the numbers on his uniform, the shouted commands in a foreign tongue, the feeling of being an insect under a boot. He clutched the book, the worn paper a comfort to his fingertips. A memory, sharp and painfully vivid, pierced through the fog of his exhaustion. He was a boy again, no older than 10, standing in the grand stone church in Heidelberg. The morning sun streamed through the high arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. He was standing beside his mother, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, her clear soprano voice rising beside his own as they sang this exact hymn. Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott, ein gute Wehr und Waffen. The memory was so complete, so real, that he could almost smell the incense in the cold stone of the ancient church. The contrast between that sunlit memory and the dim, humid reality of a Louisiana prison camp was a physical blow, a deep, hollow ache in his chest. The first notes of a small, wheezing organ began to play, pulling him back to the present, the simple melody, a fragile thread connecting 2 impossibly different worlds. The singing began. The American voices were strong and confident, filling the small chapel with the English words, A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. The German voices at first were hesitant, thin, and reedy, a mere whisper against the confident tide of the others. They were out of practice, their throats tight with suspicion and a deep, unfamiliar emotion. But as the first verse progressed, something shifted. The melody was a part of them, ingrained in their souls from countless Sundays, festivals, and funerals. It was a melody of home. Karl found his voice. It was rusty at first, a stranger in his own throat, but then it grew clearer, stronger. He sang the words he had known his entire life, words of strength and faith that he had thought were lost to him forever. For a moment, he closed his eyes, and he was no longer a prisoner in a foreign land. He was just a man, singing a song of his people. He was not Karl Neumann, prisoner number 734. He was Karl Neumann of Heidelberg, a student of literature, a son, a man who once had a future. Next to him, Corporal Davis sang in English, his voice a steady baritone. Their voices, singing different words to the same timeless melody, rose and blended in the small space. It was a strange and beautiful harmony, a sound that should have been impossible. It was the sound of two worlds colliding, not in violence, but in song. Karl opened his eyes and glanced at the American soldier. Davis was looking straight ahead, his face earnest as he sang, but he seemed to feel Karl's gaze. He turned his head slightly, and their eyes met for a brief, unguarded second. There was no animosity, only a shared moment of connection in the music that surrounded them. Further down the pew, one of the older German prisoners, a man named Franz, fumbled, not having received a book in the initial confusion. He stood silently, his lips pressed together, his face a mask of embarrassment. Without a word, without even seeming to think about it, Corporal Davis subtly angled his own English hymn book towards the man, using his finger to point to the hymn number, 12, a small, silent gesture of inclusion. Franz looked at the young American, his eyes wide with surprise, and then gave a short, grateful nod before joining his thin, wavering voice to the chorus. Klaus, Karl noticed, remained silent, his lips a thin, hard line. He was watching everything, however, his cynical mask firmly back in place, though his eyes, darting from the chaplain to the singing soldiers to the German hymn books, betrayed a flicker of deep internal conflict. The music was a bridge, a fragile structure built of melody and memory, spanning the chasm of hatred and war. For Karl, it was a profound emotional release, a cracking of the thick ice that had encased his heart for years. The shared song was a testament to a truth he had forgotten, that beneath the uniforms and the languages and the flags, there was a common pulse, a shared humanity that could, if only for a moment, transcend the divisions that tore them apart. When the final notes of the hymn faded into silence, the air in the chapel was thick with an unspoken emotion. The silence that followed was more profound than the music itself. Then, Father Dubois stepped forward to deliver his sermon. He did not stand behind the pulpit, but came to the front of the altar, closer to the men, his presence both commanding and gentle. He did not speak of victory or defeat, of sin or righteousness, of the just and the damned. His sermon was about something far simpler and far more profound. "In this place," he began, his voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room, "there are no uniforms. There are no ranks. There are no victors. And there are no vanquished." His gaze moved slowly across the pews, resting on American and German faces alike, making no distinction. "There are only souls, souls weary from the trials of this world, seeking a moment of peace. We come here from different lands, we speak in different tongues, we have seen the world from opposite sides of a battle line. But in this house, under the eyes of God, these distinctions fall away. They are meaningless." Karl listened with an intensity that surprised him. The chaplain's words were not the fiery dogma of the state-sponsored preachers he had heard back home, nor were they the hollow platitudes he had expected. They were simple, direct, and they spoke to a deep, aching void within him. "The grace of God," Father Dubois continued, his hands clasped loosely before him, "is not a prize to be won in battle. It is not a reward for virtue or a punishment for sin. It is a gift offered freely, without condition, to all who would open their hearts to receive it, no matter where they come from or what they have done. It is the rain that falls on the just and the unjust alike. It is the sun that warms the righteous and the sinner. It is a love so vast it cannot be contained by our human hatreds or our foolish wars. He spoke of forgiveness, not as something one man grants another, but as a release from the prison of one's own bitterness. He spoke of grace, not as an escape from suffering, but as the strength to endure it with one's humanity intact. Karl felt the words wash over him, not as religious doctrine, but as a profound and simple truth he had long forgotten. He felt seen, not as the enemy, not as a member of a defeated army, not as a nameless, faceless prisoner, but as a man, a weary, broken man in need of solace. He looked around the small chapel. He saw the faces of the young American soldiers, many of them no older than Heinrich. He saw the exhaustion in their eyes, the ghosts of things they had seen and done. They were not the monsters of propaganda. They were boys, sent to fight a war they likely did not understand any more than he did. He looked at his fellow Germans, at their gaunt faces and haunted eyes. They were not the glorious heroes of the fatherland. They were broken men who had lost everything. For these few, precious minutes, they were not soldiers. They were a congregation, a collection of weary, wounded souls, united not by a flag or a cause, but by their shared, desperate need for a moment of peace in a world that had offered them none. The sermon was the intellectual and spiritual core of the hour, a quiet revelation that settled in Karl's heart, not with the force of a thunderclap, but with the gentle persistence of a spring rain soaking into the dry, cracked earth of his soul. Father Dubois raised his hands, his palms open in a gesture of peace, and gave the final blessing. The Latin words, ancient and mysterious, washed over the congregation, a final seal on the strange and sacred hour. A moment of profound, resonant silence followed the last Amen. It was a silence deeper than the absence of noise, a quiet filled with the lingering echo of shared song and the weight of unspoken thoughts. The spell was finally, irrevocably broken by the mundane sound of shuffling feet on wood. The American soldiers, their brief respite over, began to file out, their movements stiff and self-conscious as they returned to their roles as captors. The Germans remained seated, a collection of gray statues in the flickering candlelight, unsure of the protocol for this impossible situation. The hour of peace was over, and the cold reality of their status was rushing back in. As Corporal Davis passed the end of Karl's pew, he paused for a fraction of a second. His eyes, clear and direct, met Karl's. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of friendship, not an invitation to camaraderie. It was something quieter, more fundamental. It was an acknowledgement, man to man. A silent confirmation that the connection forged in the music had been real, however brief. Surprised by the directness of the gesture, Karl found himself returning the nod, a small, involuntary movement of his own. Then, the corporal was gone, his back disappearing into the darkness outside the chapel door. Sergeant O'Connell's silhouette appeared in the doorway, blocking the warm light. His voice, when it came, was back to its usual flat, authoritative tone, but Karl thought he detected a subtle shift, a fraction less of the hard, metallic edge it usually carried. "All right," O'Connell said, his gaze sweeping over the seated Germans. "Let's go." The command was the same, but the air around it had changed. They rose, their limbs stiff, and walked out of the chapel. The transition was jarring, a physical shock to the senses. They stepped from the warm, pine-scented air of the chapel, with its soft, forgiving candlelight, into the harsh, naked glare of the electric floodlights that illuminated the camp yard. The magic of the moment dissipated like smoke. But the memory of it, the warmth and the light, remained, a glowing ember in the cold darkness of their minds. The walk back to the barracks was a silent procession. The 10 men were lost in their own thoughts, the shared experience a fragile bubble they were afraid to burst with words. The crunch of their boots on the gravel was the only sound, a rhythm pulling them back to the familiar world of wire and mud. The moment they pushed open the door to their barracks, the bubble burst. The long, dimly lit room was a hive of activity. The other prisoners, those not chosen for the mysterious summons, crowded around them, their faces a mixture of suspicion, fear, and intense curiosity. "Where were you?" one man demanded, his voice sharp. "What did they do to you?" another asked, his eyes searching their faces for signs of a beating. Heinrich, his face still flushed with an emotion Karl couldn't quite name, was the first to speak. His voice was full of a breathless, fragile wonder. "The chapel," he said, his eyes wide. "They took us to the chapel. We sang with them." He looked around at the disbelieving faces. "They gave us German hymn books. The chaplain, he spoke of peace for all of us." A wave of murmurs and confused questions swept through the barracks. It was then that Klaus, who had been silent since they left the chapel, found his voice again. He pushed his way through the small crowd, his face a mask of renewed cynicism. He let out a loud, scoffing laugh that was sharp and ugly in the close air. "A trick," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "It's a propaganda show. Can't you see it?" He glared at Heinrich, his eyes cold. "Don't be a fool, boy. They want to soften us, make us compliant. They dangle a little bit of home in front of your face to make you forget you're a dog on their leash. Nothing has changed. They hate us." "But why?" asked an older prisoner, a man with a deeply lined face. "Why would they go to all that trouble? The German books, the sermon? It makes no sense." Klaus's lips twisted into a sneer. "It makes perfect sense," he retorted, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rasp. "It is to break our spirit in a new way, a more clever cruelty, that is all. They beat you, you become stronger, you resist. They starve you, you dream of rebellion. But what happens when they show you kindness, when they pretend you are human? They make you question your loyalty. They make you doubt everything you have fought for. They want to turn us against ourselves, to rot us from the inside out with this false hope. It is a poison, not a gift." The men fell into a heated debate, their voices a cacophony of confusion, burgeoning hope and ingrained suspicion. Some clung to Heinrich's wide-eyed account, their faces softening with the possibility that their captors were not the monsters they had imagined. Others sided with Klaus, their expressions hardening as they embraced the familiar comfort of their hatred. It was easier to believe in a clever enemy than in an inexplicable act of grace. Through it all, Karl remained quiet. He found a spot on his bunk, away from the center of the argument, and let the voices wash over him. He knew what he had felt in that chapel. It was not a trick. It was not a performance. The feeling of his own voice joining a chorus of enemies, the sight of Corporal Davis's small, silent act of inclusion, the profound truth in the chaplain's words, these things were too real, too personal to be dismissed as propaganda. Klaus's bitter logic could not erase the simple, undeniable fact of the German hymn book resting in his hands. To argue about it here, in the foul air of the barracks, amidst the fear and the cynicism, felt like a betrayal. It would be like trying to describe the color of a sunset to a man born blind. The experience was his, a private treasure to be guarded, not a topic for public debate. He was processing it, internalizing the moment, letting it settle deep within him where the poison of Klaus's words could not reach. Much later, the barracks finally quieted down. The arguments had exhausted themselves, replaced by the familiar night sounds of a room full of sleeping men, the soft sighs, the occasional cough, the rustle of straw mattresses. The air was thick and still. Karl waited until he was sure everyone was asleep. Then, he carefully reached under his thin mattress and pulled out his most prized possession, a small, worn diary and the stub of a pencil. He shielded his small space with a threadbare blanket and, with trembling fingers, lit a smuggled stub of a candle. The tiny flame flickered to life, casting a small, warm circle of light in the vast darkness of the barracks. He sat for a long moment, the open diary on his lap, the pencil in his hand. He looked around at the sleeping forms of his fellow soldiers, their faces peaceful in the dim light, their bodies finally at rest. He saw the shadows dancing on the rough wooden walls, shadows that usually seemed menacing, but tonight, in the gentle candlelight, they were just shadows. He hesitated, trying to find the words, to distill the overwhelming emotions of the evening into the small, finite space of a page. How could he describe the shift that had occurred within him? It was not a grand revelation, but a quiet turning, a subtle realignment of his soul. He took a deep breath and began to write. The scratching of the pencil against the cheap paper was the only sound in the sleeping barracks. The camera of his memory focused on the words as he formed them, each letter a small act of defiance against the despair that had consumed him for so long. The narrator's voice, deep and thoughtful, reads the words as Karl writes them. October 2nd, 1945. They took us to their chapel tonight. We walked in a line, expecting mockery or worse. We walked in as enemies, our hearts heavy with fear and hatred, but they handed us hymn books, in German, in our own language. The chaplain spoke of a grace that is not earned, but given freely. The American soldiers, the men we were taught to kill, the men who defeated us, they sang beside us. Their words were different, but the melody was the same. For 1 hour, surrounded by the enemy, in the heart of a foreign land, thousands of miles from everything I have ever known, I was not a number. I was not a prisoner. I was not a defeated soldier. For 1 hour, I felt like a man of faith again, not just a defeated enemy. He finished writing and closed the diary, the small book feeling warm in his hands. He blew out the candle, plunging his small space back into darkness. But the darkness felt different now. It was no longer absolute. The small, flickering flame of the candle had been extinguished, but a new, more resilient light had been kindled within him. It was a small flame, to be sure, and the winds of this place were strong, but it was there. The next morning, the sun rose over the Louisiana camp, casting a pale, golden light over the familiar landscape of misery. The work was the same. The mud was the same, sucking at Karl's boots with the same greedy appetite. The barbed wire fences were the same, their sharp points glinting in the morning sun. On the surface, nothing had changed. The world was still a harsh, unforgiving place. But as Karl dug his shovel into the damp earth, he found himself looking across the yard, his gaze settling on the small wooden chapel. It stood there, simple and unassuming, as it had every other day. But to him, it looked different now. It was no longer just a building he had barely noticed. It was a landmark, a symbol. It was a testament to the fact that even here, in this place of profound despair, a moment of grace was possible. He saw Sergeant O'Connell standing near the edge of the work area, watching the prisoners with his usual stern expression. As Karl paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, their eyes met across the yard. It was only for a brief second. There was no smile from O'Connell, no change in his weary, hardened demeanor. But the open hostility that Karl had always perceived in the sergeant's gaze, the cold contempt of a victor for the vanquished, was gone. It had been replaced by something more neutral, something more tired, something that acknowledged their shared confinement in this miserable place, albeit on different sides of the wire. The oppressive heat of the Louisiana morning felt just a little less heavy. The future was still a vast, terrifying unknown. The war was over, but he was still a prisoner, and the path home was long and uncertain. But for the first time in a very long time, that future was no longer entirely without hope. Karl turned his face back towards the chapel, a quiet, thoughtful expression settling upon him. He then turned back to his work, the rhythm of the shovel a steady beat in a world that had, against all odds, revealed a crack of light in its suffocating darkness.